Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Coming up then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Conservative commentator Tim Montgomerie and the politics editor for the online magazine GalDem, Moya Lothian-Mclean. They'll be with us right through until midnight. To the front pages, though, first of all, the Metro splashing with "Up Your Game." Reportedly, the Prime Minister's message to social media firms over how they police racism on their platforms. According to The Eye, Instagram has said the use of the monkey emoji in racially abusive messages to England players doesn't, in and of itself, constitute a violation of its community standards. However, it's important to point out the company has not condoned the messages themselves. The Sun reports that the father of England defender Harry Maguire had his ribs broken in the disturbances at Wembley on Sunday night. The Telegraph speaks to a couple who claimed they were barred from boarding a flight when it emerged they'd been given doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was made in India. While the Star takes a look at personal responsibility around the lifting of COVID restrictions. There's anger among MPs, including Boris Johnson's own backbenchers, over the government's £4 billion reduction to the foreign aid budget. That's the lead for The Guardian. The Daily Mail has word that British soldiers will not be prosecuted in relation to incidents during the Troubles. That is also the lead for The Express. Witch hunts have hounded veterans to end, their headline. And the Financial Times has a story concerning the US Consumer Price Index. So, Tim Montgomerie and Moya Lothian-Mclean are here. Welcome to both of you. Great to see you. Well, plenty to discuss. Different stories, has to be said, all over the front pages. Let's kick off with the Metro, the fallout from the racial abuse of certain England players, the government's decision to meet up with tech companies. Up your game, the headline, Tim, for the Metro. Was this just good diversion from the government, do you think, facing its own criticism after their failure to call out, or some of them, the taking of the knee ahead of the tournament?
You're being so cynical, Anna, to suggest that the government would ever...
Didn't it?
Well, look, I think one of the silliest expressions we've ever heard in sort of our upbringing was that old rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. We know that the abuse that is directed at any of us, for whatever reason, can really sting. And I think, the truth is, and that the good truth is, that most people's experience of racism in sort of the real, tangible world has generally been in decline. We've seen some horrible examples where it's very real in the last couple of days, not least with the Marcus Rashford mural. But where the abuse is sort of out of control is in social media. Much of it, as Gareth Southgate has said, is coming from abroad, but some is still coming from the UK. And part of the problem, I think, with social media is that anyone can set up an account on most of these platforms. There's no credit card or anything else involved, so that it's impossible or very difficult to trace people if they've used a false email address after they've said something perhaps racist or objectionable in another way. And I think it's long past time that the government really puts the social media giants onto the hotspot and ask them to actually justify how they are registering people who might be guilty of these horrible examples of racist abuse we've seen online.
Yes, and The Eye, I suppose, digs into some of the defence of these tech companies. Monkey emojis OK to send to black players, says Instagram. They use algorithms, we know, to try and weed all of this out. So many messages, of course, are sent, Moya. The point, I suppose, they're trying to make is that not every time a monkey emoji is used, it's meant in any racially pejorative way.
Well, I do think it's important to point out that Instagram itself has not individually responded to the monkey emojis. In fact, it's the automatic response which goes to the heart of the problem. When they said they didn't go against our community guidelines, that is an automatic response people receive when they report this racism. But that is the problem, because they use these algorithms, because the human moderators they have in place are either too few or they're overwhelmed by the amount of content they're having to sift through. These things are not being caught. The content context is not being captured. And what you get instead is things like racism slips through the net, whereas I think we saw recently in certain countries you'll have pro-LGBT or pro-ethnic minority sentiments instead get caught out on social media. And it's really interesting because there's been a lot of research into algorithms and how algorithms can often reflect sort of systematic racism in our societies because they're built by people just like you or me, and those biases get baked in. So what we have to look at here is the use of algorithms and also the use of moderators, and how can these companies improve them? I think it's very important to note that Instagram is owned by Facebook, and Facebook has also been plagued by these problems.
Yes, and I suppose somebody who has their account cancelled could just get a new email address and start another one. I mean, it's it's a never-ending problem in some respects, isn't it? But what about the politicians in all of this? The finger pointed specifically at Priti Patel, as we've heard in the last 2 days, Boris Johnson before as well. The Eye telling us that the PM has avoided an awkward Downing Street reception for the squad following this row with Priti Patel. And going to The Guardian, Steve Baker has also been speaking out about this, hasn't he, Tim? What has he said?
Yeah, I think this is the second sort of quite prominent Conservative MP who has expressed concern at the position that the Conservative Party, the Conservative government's taken. We had Johnny Mercer, the former Defence Minister, yesterday. And now we've had Steve Baker, who I think has been someone who, like me, has worried about the connotations of taking the knee. I hope none of the people who've been sort of spotlighted over the last couple of days by critics of the Conservative Party support the kind of racism that we have seen. But some of us do object to the Black Lives Matter movement and some of its extreme views in the USA, including defunding the police and opposing things like capitalism and the nuclear family. But I think Steve Baker might be onto something. He's saying that despite all the kind of intellectual arguments that I've just made and that people like him have just made, the overall thing that people are hearing from the Conservative Party is that they oppose measures and gestures, acts that oppose racial justice. And if that is fundamentally where the Conservative Party has got to in the eyes of young England players, young Britons generally, then that's obviously a bad place for the Conservative Party to be. Intellectually defensible position, but perhaps emotionally and politically, the Conservative Party has got to sort of, I've got to sort of recalibrate what we're saying in order to make it clear to people anti-racism and people who are guilty of racism that there is no place for any kind of hateful attitude, a bit of bigotry in British society.
So I mean, the point that Priti Patel had made, that this was gesture politics, should she not be saying stuff like that because it gives the wrong impression, or did she genuinely believe that and therefore said it? I mean, what's the point? Where do you go from there, from what you've said, Tim?
Well, I would say I supported what Priti Patel said. I felt that the taking the knee gesture was so associated with the Black Lives Matter movement that has an extreme political agenda that it wasn't objectionable. I did object to it. I do object to it. But you get to a point where people begin to think that your opposition to taking the knee is because you oppose racial justice. And after a while, you just have to give up on an intellectual argument and just oppose and just sort of surrender almost. And I'm afraid that's where we might have got to on this point, because the battle against racism is far more important than fighting some sort of tactical battle against the Black Lives Matter movement, although I'm not quite willing to give up on that fully. Yeah,
and I suppose Gareth Southgate, Moya, really did try to explain it right at the start, didn't he, about put yourself in the position of a young black player and how they feel about that. That's where you need to be on this issue, and perhaps people like Tim are listening to that too.
Well, yes, exactly. And I think it's very interesting that Tim has, in fact, changed his mind, because I heard him on BBC Politics Live and Channel 4 earlier, in fact, still saying that taking the knee was representing this divisive sort of politics. So that change of heart must have come very quickly. But I must say, I'm pleased to hear it, because the only way to oppose racism is to be actively anti-racist. And the fact that even people like Steve Baker are recognising that being the attitude to taking a knee is becoming associated with active sort of racist sentiments and is being wildly opposed by the majority of the public, says to me that we're on our way to recognising what people have been trying to say from the beginning, that taking the knee was a gesture to oppose racism. And if you're against a gesture to oppose racism, I have to ask, what are you standing for?
Yeah, and some amazing scenes today in Manchester at this Marcus Rashford mural, which is a double-page spread in the Daily Mail of people covering up graffiti with supportive messages. I mean, that's really genuinely heartwarming, isn't it, after what we've seen and what we've talked about for the last couple of days, Tim?
Absolutely. I think Marcus Rashford is not just behind me. There's a picture of Old Trafford. I'm a Manchester United fan, and so I'm a Marcus Rashford fan as well. But he's just a great human being. You know, I may not agree with all of his political emphasis, but his concern to feed children, his concern to produce a more equitable society, is just a good person. He's a role model for so many young people. And yeah, he missed a really bad penalty. His attempt the other night was atrocious for a footballer, but that hasn't got anything to do with the nastiness and bile that's been directed to him in the last few days. His statement in response, the support for his community, that's in a way what we should focus on. The racists shouldn't get the attention that they deserve. The people putting those stickers on that mural, they are, I think, the true representatives of the British people, and we should celebrate them rather than focus on the nastiness of the racists.
Quick thought, Moya?
Yeah, I think we should focus on the people and the British people who have put those stickers up. But I think we also have to recognise who stokes racism in this country and how people at the top can exacerbate that sentiment on the ground, and why we might be in a position where the mural of Marcus Rashford is defaced, and how can we start combating that?
Yeah. Mural is a word I can't say, actually. I noticed you had the same problem. No idea how you're supposed to pronounce that. It's a bit like George Bush in nuclear, I seem to remember, isn't it? Well, coming up, Scotland's First Minister and the Mayor of London break with Boris Johnson in their guidance on masks. We will find out more in just a moment. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, Tim Montgomerie and Moya Lothian-Mclean. Welcome back to both of you. So masks are still a hot issue, it appears, makes the front page of the Financial Times, Moya. Nicola Sturgeon and indeed the London Mayor both wanting to keep them. Yet we've heard defence again today from the government for moving forward. Your thoughts on this?
Yes, while we had a defence, I think it was a much more muted defence than we have in previous weeks. Boris said that masks would be required in most indoor spaces, even if they're not going to legislate for them. And I think Scotland's refutation of getting rid of masks altogether or putting it down to personal responsibility shows that there has been an overwhelming shift on the side of the scientists who have been calling for these masks. So I don't think masks are going anywhere, is the short answer.
Yeah, Tim, do you think the government had wished they hadn't been so free and easy with this? Many a minister has come out and said, I can't wait to get rid of them. Was that the wrong tone, do you think, from a few weeks ago?
Yes, Anna, in a word, I think it was probably the wrong tone. Overall, I think the government direction is right. Given the level of vaccination we have in the UK now, the time of year, if we can't sort of liberate people now and get things like the entertainment sector, back up and running, where many jobs and livelihoods, upon which to depend upon. But I also think that whereas you can excuse not having masks in places like restaurants and nightclubs, which people can choose to attend or not attend, lots of people need public transport. They have to go on public transport for work, to see family, for medical appointments. And so I think it's important, actually, as the Mayor of London and First Minister of Scotland are doing, is to continue to have mandatory mask wearing in those setups. Yeah.
Let's move on to foreign aid. Sorry to speed through. Win for the government, but at the cost of a number of former Conservative Prime Ministers coming out and disagreeing with them, Moya.
Yeah, so this is unfortunately, they forced a quick vote on foreign aid cuts, which initially had been passed back in January, and they've stayed in place. But there was some Tory rebels, I think about 24, because there's been serious discontent with the cuts that are happening, which will be about 4 billion, and the impact this is going to have on the poorest people around the world, particularly women who in war zone areas, sexual health services. Those aspects are going to be really hit hard by us removing aid, and a lot of people in the government think it just doesn't make sense.
OK, Moya, Tim, thank you both so much.